Hi, everyone. Hey, everyone. Let me click this up a little bit. Can you hear me in the back? Good. Greg can hear me in the back. Fantastic. Thank you, Greg. Welcome, everybody. So this is the very first program on climate change colloquium. Welcome, everybody. So I'm Kyle Armour. I'm the interim director of the program on climate change. So this is our first attempt at this program on climate change colloquium series. So we're starting this quarter. The whole idea behind this is to kind of rotate around through different departments. So collect, the normal atmospheric sciences and climate crowd here, but also hopefully special guests from other units and other departments coming to see these talks as well. And the idea is that we're going to have these roughly once a month, rotating around to different units. So today I'll introduce Abby Swann in just a moment, who graciously has stepped up to give the very first one of these. But next month we'll have Alex Gagnon speaking in oceanography, and then I believe Eric Steig later on this quarter, and then we'll rotate through other groups in the next coming quarters. And the whole idea behind this is really to kind of stimulate more conversation between the different units on campus and get more interdisciplinary collaboration going, and also just celebrate all the great science that we do here at the UW. So that's it for the purpose of the colloquium series. And like I said, Abby was really gracious to kind of take this on and lead us off on this. So just to introduce Abby Swann, she's a professor in the departments of biology and in the Department of Atmospheric and Climate Sciences. She's the endowed professor in the College of the Environment and Climate and Ecosystems, and she runs the Eco-Climate Lab in the departments that she's in. And her work really spans quite a bit, involving land ecosystems and interacting with the climate system. She's done a lot of great work on the role of vegetation and feedbacks with the atmosphere. And the stuff that she's going to present today is work involving the carbon cycle. So I think these are kind of new efforts to move into kind of the climate and carbon space. Exciting new work that is in progress, going to come out soon. Abby got her PhD at Berkeley in 2010. She went to Harvard for a couple years as a postdoc and started here as a faculty member in 2012, I believe. We overlapped very briefly. I think you came probably like a month before I graduated and left, and I was very happy to come back and be your colleague after that. And she's been a professor here ever since, and now is a full professor and an endowed professor. So yeah, with that, hand it over to Abby. Take it away.
All right, great. Thanks, Kyle. Can folks in the back hear me okay? Great. So I'm also in charge of the Atmospheric and Climate Science Colloquium series this fall. So I just want to say that we have a great lineup of talks, several of which are particularly exciting to the whole PCC community. And you can sign up for the PCC's events calendar that Miriam does a wonderful job adding all of the climate relevant talks to. You can subscribe to that calendar, or you can just look at that list of events to find really relevant stuff happening on campus. So we'll be hearing from a number of folks this quarter, including John Proctor and Marisa Legou and Greg Queaton and others. And next week for the atmospheric science folks, Alex Anderson Frey is going to be speaking. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about carbon cycle and climate under declining and zero emissions. And this work is in collaboration especially with Charlie Colvin and Christy Protesescu and Ben Sanderson. There's been a bunch of other contributors, but it's really new, and I haven't actually shared most of what I've done with them yet. So you're seeing an early days thought process on this topic that I've been thinking about. And we've got some funding from NSF and DOE. So I'm going to introduce the carbon cycle, and then I'm going to talk about how I'm thinking about carbon, especially on land, as emissions go to zero and decline even farther than that. As Kyle mentioned, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the role of ecosystems in the climate system, a lot of it about energy and water. This is going to be basically all about carbon today. To think about energy and water, you have to think about carbon. But that hasn't been my focus. And so I've always been thinking about carbon, but now I'm going to explicitly focus on that for this presentation. Oh, this image in the background we're going to come back to later in the talk. It's a change in carbon over time. Okay, so to introduce this topic, I wanted to remind you all that humans have emitted a lot of carbon into the atmosphere from the emission of fossil fuel burning and land use. This is a time series of what that looks like, in case you're not familiar. So going back to the beginning, the pre-industrial period, we've got a big, a slow increase in emissions and a very rapid increase in emissions coming from these different sources. And our emissions are something in the order of 10 petagrams carbon per year at this point. It's made up of these different pieces, but mostly we're just going to be thinking about the total emissions here. So humans are dumping carbon into the atmosphere. What happens to that carbon? Many of us think about the response of the climate system to this, but let's walk through a little bit piece by piece. So the carbon goes into the atmosphere. This is what the atmospheric carbon has done. Many will be familiar with this plot. We've had a big increase in the CO2 in the atmosphere over time. So atmospheric CO2 is rising. We can go through the details of why we know this is coming from human emissions, but basically some of that carbon is staying in the atmosphere, but not all of it, and that is contributing to this increase over time. So where is the carbon now? Well, we've got carbon in 4 pools we're going to talk about. We've got carbon in the atmosphere, which you'll see is actually the smallest amount of carbon, even though I drew it as the biggest box. So about 800 gigatons. A gigaton and a petagram are the same. Sorry, I didn't unify all the slides. I tried. We've got some carbon in rocks. We've got some carbon in plants and soils. And we've got some carbon in the ocean. Nearly all of the carbon is in the ocean. It's one thing to take away from this. So on the long time scales, the ocean is going to really dominate what happens with carbon cycling on Earth. But on human time scales, the rocks are basically not taking up carbon fast enough to be very important. And we're going to find that the fluxes from the land are really important because those annual fluxes are really big. Even though on really long time scales, the ocean's going to drive the boat because it's got all the carbon. So from our rock pool of carbon, we're emitting fossil fuels into the atmosphere. And that's where that extra carbon is coming from. And since this pool of carbon is so slow to take up carbon, we can basically think of this as a one-way street. Fossil fuels go into the atmosphere. And that's the big perturbation of the carbon system, right? We took carbon that was tied up in rocks and we dumped it back into the atmosphere. Old, dead, squished plants. From our land box, we're going to have 2 things that are going to control the carbon going in and out of the atmosphere. We're going to have photosynthesis, taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it onto land. And then we're generally going to have respiration processes, all of them together, emitting carbon back into the atmosphere. And we'll come back and think about the specifics of that, but it's photosynthesis and respiration. In the ocean, things governing the fluxes are a little bit more physically controlled. So we've got air-sea fluxes, the actual exchange, how do you get a gas to exchange from the inside the ocean to the atmosphere. We've got carbonate chemistry. That's going to be a really, really important component of how much carbon you get into the ocean. We've got ocean photosynthesis and respiration. Cycles very quickly, but it's going to be involved particularly in setting the mean state for the ocean. But carbonate chemistry, air-sea fluxes, really this carbonate chemistry and ocean circulation are going to dominate the response of the ocean to change. And so one important point I want to note early on here is that the land uptake of anthropogenic carbon, meaning carbon humans put in the atmosphere, it depends entirely on biological processes, photosynthesis, respiration, a whole bunch of stuff that adds up to contribute to that. Whereas the ocean uptake of anthropogenic carbon, this extra carbon we put into the atmosphere, is controlled mostly by physics and chemistry on these human timescales. And that's just going to be a different type of problem to solve, right? The physics and chemistry and the biology are different sets of things we don't know. So the best guess of our carbon budget since the pre-industrial is like this. So we've looked at this piece of this carbon budget here. We start with 285 parts per million in the atmosphere in about 1850, and we add all these bits of carbon. That's the cumulative emission of carbon into the atmosphere since then. So coal, oil, gas, land use change, like deforestation. That should have put us way up here, above 600 parts per million in the atmosphere. So all the carbon that humans dumped in the atmosphere would make the atmospheric CO2 a lot higher than it is right now. So where did it go? Because we're only at 419 right now-ish. It's gone into land and ocean. So these are the cumulative sinks of carbon that have gone into land and ocean. You know, here's some numbers on them. We could say maybe those numbers are slightly different, but either way, you can see that actually, you know, something like half or a little bit less than half of all the carbon that humans put in the atmosphere isn't there anymore. It went into the land and the ocean. And the really big question when we think forward into the future is what is going to happen to those carbon sinks in the future? Where is this extra carbon that went into land and ocean? Where is it going to go? Is it going to keep going into land and ocean? Is it not? Because if it doesn't, then it's going to end up in the atmosphere. And that becomes a forcing on our climate system. So we know that warming increases more on Earth with greater emissions of greenhouse gases. This is a plot from the IPCC just showing us these different colors or different scenarios. And the major difference between them is the amount of anthropogenic carbon that humans emit under these different assumptions about many things about human society and the climate system. But the big difference is how much CO2, basically. Some other slight variances, but you got a lot more carbon in this top one than you do in this bottom one. And so we know that the warming depends on the emissions. But it turns out an emergent property of this system that we found is that the warming actually scales really linearly with cumulative emissions. So instead of time here on this axis, now we have the cumulative emissions of carbon. So this is cumulative emissions of anthropogenic carbon that we've dumped into the atmosphere. And we can see that the global surface temperature increases pretty linearly with that emission. This is the observational period here. So obviously there's more going on than just emission of CO2 there, but it's still pretty linear. And then if we look beyond that, we can see these different colored scenarios now kind of lie on top of each other. They have the same relationship between cumulative emissions of carbon and warming. And so that's telling us something potentially very interesting about the climate system, that it's got some balancing of processes or some emergent property that we get this linear relationship. You can also see that there's a spread. This spread is showing you some distribution across, what different climate models predict for this linear slope, but it's still pretty linear. So what are some of the reasons for this spread? Those are the things we don't know about how much warming you got for cumulative emissions. Well, we know that there's spread that's going to come from uncertainties in the physical climate system, so how fast the ocean takes up heat, cloud responses, basically everything that impacts climate sensitivity is going to have some impact on the slope of this relationship. But also, embedded in here is the rate of carbon sink. So sink being the removal of carbon from the atmosphere. And so anything that impacts the sinks is also potentially impacting the slope of this line. And those sinks we're going to broadly group into land and ocean. And so if you account for these simulations, each model would have made one assumption about climate, and they would have kept their concentrations associated with emissions fixed. But we can actually run climate models or Earth system models with fully interactive carbon cycles, meaning we're going to represent the emission of carbon into the atmosphere, how fast that carbon gets taken up into land and ocean, and that will change the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So this plot is showing for a single scenario, for a high emission scenario. If we look over time again, we've got individual models in this blue, and the mean of all the concentration-driven models in red. These individual blue models have interactive carbon cycles, and this would be the mean of them. So what we would expect is that they should look like this red line, but when we let their carbon cycles be interactive, they do more different things, right? It affects this trajectory somewhat. And so these different carbon sinks can create spreads in what we think expect for future climate for a given scenario. One of the arguments I'm going to make today is that this across model spread, the thing that we're going to care about from a carbon cycle perspective, so we're going to really focus on that carbon sink piece of this, is largely driven by land fluxes and not by ocean fluxes. Again, on this human sort of century time scale. This is a plot, I'll explain more about what's happening in time, but we have constant emissions in time. And we were on the same y-axis here. This is the land carbon sink, and this is the ocean carbon sink. And you can see the spread. These different colors are different climate, different Earth system models. And the spread in the ocean sink on the right is just way smaller than the spread in the land sink on the left. And again, this is first order, I would say due to the fact that ocean uptake is controlled mostly by physics and chemistry, and that is more similar across models. It is definitely not the same, and there's all kinds of interesting things there. But in terms of leading to this uncertainty in the model projection, biology is just it's complicated. We don't know how to do it. There's a lot of different assumptions that have to get made, and so you end up with a much bigger spread. Okay, so that's my first take-home point. Land carbon flux is dominated by biology, and that makes it complicated and messy. And that's kind of in the background of all the things we're looking at here. Because my goal at the moment for today is to try to understand what's going on with land carbon sinks under different emissions scenarios. So let's come back to our plot of warming scaling with cumulative emissions. And I want to point out that this relationship that warming goes up with cumulative emissions implies that if cumulative emissions stops increasing, you stop moving to the right on this plot, that warming should stop. Which means the temperature will stop rising when emissions per year equals 0. That's the sort of first order expectation. So that is why, to first order, if we get to net zero emissions or 0 emissions of carbon, the Earth should stop warming. It comes from this framing here. We're going to show that that's not exactly true, but largely that's what happens in climate models, is that they're going to get warmer with emissions, and then they're going to have drastically less warming when emissions go to 0. But let's look at what happens when emissions do go to 0. So does warming stop when emissions go to 0? So we're going to look at something called the Zero Emissions Commitment. And that name, I think, is somewhat confusing, but that's what people call it, so you should know. And what it is quantifying the amount of temperature change you get some amount of time after emissions went to 0 and then stayed at 0. So what happens when emissions go to 0 and stay at 0? They go to 0 here at the beginning of this time series. They're staying at 0 for 100 years. This is from AR6, IPCC AR6. We had a set of simulations from Earth system models that did this. The atmospheric CO2 starts dropping. This is because land and ocean sinks are removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So land and ocean sinks are still operating, and we're no longer putting extra carbon into the atmosphere, and so those sinks are drawing down the carbon over time. This is the radiative forcing on the system, right, is the CO2 in the atmosphere. We would think more CO2 in the atmosphere, hotter planet. But what happens with temperature, same axes, right? We start at 0 and then we go out for 100 years, is that it basically stays kind of flat. And this purple arrow is the assessed likely range of plus minus 3 degrees Celsius at 50 years. There's a lot of bouncing around, maybe there's a different distribution here, but it's pretty close to 0, right? There's not a lot of temperature change. And so that's interesting. We can think about how this is actually some emergent balance between the rate at which the sinks are drawing down carbon and the rate at which ocean heat uptake is progressing. I'm not really going to talk about that today, but I think it's super interesting that seems to mostly balance, and I think it's an emergent property, not a defined characteristic. But okay, we've got these two major metrics of the climate system that tell us a lot about how climate should progress as we go forward. We've got the fact that warming should scale with cumulative emissions. That's this thing, the transient climate response to emissions, or the TCRE. And then we have how much warming after we get to 0 emissions, or this zero emissions commitment. So how much are you going to warm for emissions, and how much will you adjust temperature after we get emissions to 0? So we're going to look at what these look like in Earth system model simulations from a new set of experiments. These experiments are called FLAT 10. They were part of the fast track for CMIP 7. So this is the initial model intercomparison that was put together in order to establish this as an experimental protocol. And then in the next round of the coupled model intercomparison project, we are expecting that a lot of models will do these, and we'll have a lot more to look at. But what's important about them is that they are run in models that have fully interactive carbon cycles. And instead of defining a trajectory of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we define the emissions of carbon into the atmosphere. So for 100 years, there's 10 petagrams carbon per year of emissions. Remember from the beginning, that's about what fossil fuel land use emissions are now. So that's kind of like current anthropogenic emissions. We emit 10 petagrams per year for 100 years. So that's 1,000 petagrams of emissions. That's also about what some of the endpoints of emissions were in other scenarios. So it's very idealized, but it's got some characteristics that are similar to simulations you're used to if you've looked at climate model simulations before. And this is emissions go to 0 at year 100, and then they stay at 0 for 200 more years. This allows us to really easily calculate these two quantities. So the transient climate response to emissions, the TCRE, is this. It's the temperature you reach at year 100 because you've emitted 1,000 petagrams of carbon. And the zero emissions commitment is usually defined at some time, but you could define it at any time. So it's the change in temperature from this point of zero emissions to whatever time point you pick after that. So the change in temperature after year 100. Okay, so super idealized scenario has some characteristics that look kind of like scenarios we've looked at before. What do we expect temperature to look like in these scenarios? Well, we expect it to look like cumulative emissions. And so this is the plot of cumulative emissions, 10 petagrams per year till you get to 1,000, and then it stays flat. And so to first order, that's what we think temperature will do. It will go up for the first 100 years, and then it will stay flat. So we're going to look at temperature first, and then we're going to come back and we're going to look at what's happening with carbon on land. Okay, so first up, let's look at how temperature scales with cumulative emissions during this phase when we are emitting carbon into the atmosphere. So these are some Earth system models, simulations where they did this experiment, and we can see, this is emissions of carbon over time here, and we can see that we get these different lines. These little notations show you, here's a warming of 3 degrees for 1,000 petagrams, 2 degrees, 1 degree. You can see there's kind of a cluster of them in the middle, maybe one that's higher, one that's lower. Most of them are showing pretty linear responses of warming to cumulative emissions. That's something we've seen in climate model simulations before, so not surprising, but it's also happening here. You can kind of see what the spread is on that TCRE, or transient climate response to emissions. This is from the first flat 10-minute paper by Sanderson et al. We also did simple climate model simulations along with this. So we have a set of these 3 different simple climate models. Each one ran a large ensemble of different simulations in the same experiment, tweaking different parameters, constraining them to observations during the historical period, and then projecting this simple experiment. And you can see that they're kind of, in the range of what these Earth system models show. So one of my big questions, which I'm not totally able to answer for you yet, is to ask, how much does carbon cycling impact TCRE? These different models have different assumptions they make about carbon cycling, but they have a lot of differences between them. They have lots of differences in their physical climate system. It's not a super well-controlled experiment, so we know that there's differences in their carbon cycling, but there's a lot of differences between them. One sort of peek at this that we have is that there is an ensemble of simulations with an old version of the Hadley Center model, so HADCM3, back from, these simulations were done in something like 2007 or 2008. And they didn't do this experiment, but they also did an experiment for which you can plot cumulative emissions versus temperature. And this is on the same scale. This is the spread across a single model when you make different assumptions in just a few land parameters. And so one model is able to generate this spread that is larger than the spread across these Earth system models. One little tweak to this is that it's actually up here on the distribution, so it's a pretty different value of this transient climate response to emissions. You do expect different experiments would give you slightly different values, and so, I don't know if it's directly comparable, but if we come back to thinking about this spread, this suggests that assumptions about what's going on land are going to change the trajectory of this, right? Nothing about the clouds or other things are being prescribed to change in these experiments. We're just changing things like the optimum temperature for photosynthesis. So I think that's really intriguing, and I would really like to look into it more, but I don't really have, other than this set of simulations, we don't really have simulations to address that yet. Okay, so the models show this linear response. There's a spread across models. We get some estimate of what that spread is. Now let's look at the zero emissions commitment. So again, this is the adjustment to temperature after emissions get to zero. And so emissions go to zero here in year 100, and then temperature adjusts over time. And this is the spread across these different Earth system models. And you can see it's still, pretty big, but kind of the same range as it was in IPCC AR6. That's that purple arrow from the other plot that we looked at. So kind of the same-ish range. Most of these models are of the same vintage that would have been in AR6. We can add the simple models to this plot as well, and we can see that they're broadly within the range, but they tend to be more negative. So they tend to show that the temperature should actually cool slightly after we get to zero emissions. It's important to note that this is a zero emissions commitment, which sort of makes it sound like it involves warming, but it very well might not, right? It could be zero, but it could definitely be negative. We could experience cooling after we get to zero emissions. You can imagine if there's a lot of ocean heat uptake and a lot of carbon sink, you're going to have cooler temperatures. Okay, so now we're going to put these two experiments together, and we're going to look at the full time series. And so that looks like this. This is the temperature, global mean average surface temperature over time, and our expectation is it should look like cumulative emissions, like this orange line. So it should go up for 100 years and it should stay pretty flat. And we could tell from the fact that we had the TCRE and the ZEC being fairly close to zero that that's broadly what happens, right? They increase in temperature until you get to net zero emissions here, and then they stay pretty flat. But that you can see because they have different amounts that they warm during this time when there's a lot of emissions, they end up at really different surface temperatures. So what's happening to atmospheric CO2? We looked at that from the earlier analysis from the IPCC. This is the atmospheric CO2 in these simulations. And so you can see it rises as there is emissions in the atmosphere. Emissions stop right here. They go to zero, and then the atmospheric CO2 starts to drop. And just as a reminder, the emissions are zero during that period, but the land and the ocean are still taking up carbon. We still expect the land to be taking up carbon for some amount of time. The ocean is still taking up carbon, and so that is drawing down the CO2 in the atmosphere. That's reducing the radiative forcing. Temperature is still staying about flat because it's being balanced by ocean heat uptake. So that's a little bit of the climate system context. I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about what's happening because of this, what's happening with carbon on land. So let's take a closer look at what's happening with land carbon sinks. Okay, so let's boil down our carbon cycle here. We're going to leave the ocean out for now, the rest of the talk, and we're just going to think about we've got an atmosphere and we've got plants and soil and they've got carbon in them. The processes controlling how carbon goes in and out of the atmosphere are photosynthesis, taking carbon out, and respiration, putting carbon back in. So let's talk about what we broadly expect to happen with photosynthesis and respiration. And first I wanted to mention that photosynthesis is measured like this most of the time. So this is a clamp on a leaf. And a lot of our understanding of how photosynthesis works is putting a clamp on a leaf and changing the conditions inside the little chamber and figuring out how photosynthesis changes. Maybe you put the whole plant in a box, but like leaf or plant. And we're going to try to derive what we think is going to happen to global photosynthesis from that. But there's a lot of caveats. Another way we're going to get this information is from things. This is an eddy covariance flux tower, so maybe you're measuring it a little bit more at an ecosystem or plot level scale. But that's really where a lot of our understanding of photosynthesis is going to come from. Okay, so broadly, what's going to happen? Well, photosynthesis per area of leaf against temperature, we generally expect that photosynthesis will go up with temperature to a point. It's going to reach some optimum temperature, and then photosynthesis is going to start to decline. And there's a lot of things baked into this. So this is the direct effects of temperature, but also the indirect effects of the fact that hotter temperatures make the air drier, and that also impacts plants. Again, this is derived very much from like a leaf level perspective. You can also see it at that tower scale. The point at which this optimum temperature, where is this optimum temperature is something that can vary depending on where you live. So, if you're a plant in the tropics, your optimum temperature is probably higher than if you're a plant that lives in the boreal forest. Plants can also acclimate, meaning they can move this optimum around a little bit, either on short time scales over a season or also across years. So it might be that plants get a little bit better at dealing with hotter temperatures. But at some point it gets too hot and photosynthesis is going to decline. Sort of a broad average across plants, these are temperatures that we experience, right? That we reach this optimum, something like 30 C. Okay, carbon dioxide is also high in the atmosphere, so what's happening is carbon dioxide is going up. Well, as CO2 increases, photosynthesis per leaf area goes up to some point, and then it doesn't really care anymore about just CO2. This is like one factor at a time. If I just increase CO2 in a plant in a box, it's going to increase to some point. At the leaf level, this is something like 400 parts per million. But there's lots of other things that could influence what might be stressing a plant as it gets warmer and CO2 goes up, and CO2 could contribute to water stress and other things. So we wouldn't necessarily expect photosynthesis to stop growing right at 400 in the real full Earth system. But at the leaf level, that's about where we are now in the atmosphere. We also expect that leaf area would change, right? So these are all rates per leaf area, but we also expect that the area of leaves could go up. So as photosynthesis increases, plants can grow more leaves. At some point, we don't really know what's going to happen there, right? There must be some maximum, or, plant growth is not expected to continue indefinitely, but we would expect some more plant growth. Water stress could also limit photosynthesis, and I couldn't come up with a nice simple diagram for you for this one, but basically water stress could decrease because plants have a little bit of an easier time getting carbon dioxide when there's a lot of it in the atmosphere. And so they might decrease their water stress in higher CO2 conditions. But climate's also changing, so higher temperatures, higher demand for evaporation, changes in precipitation might cause water stress to increase. And so I don't think we know that photosynthesis is necessarily going up, but generally the way we write the equations for how plants work in climate models suggests that temperature and CO2 will drive photosynthesis up for some amount of time. Okay, so that's the down arrow, right? What's going to happen to photosynthesis? What about respiration? Respiration is the up arrow. Respiration we think of as exponential with temperature. So we expect respiration to go up with temperature, and we expect it to go up a lot with a lot more temperature. It can also acclimate a little bit, but we do expect a lot more respiration as temperature goes up. And the land sink is the difference between these two things. So the land sink is the difference between two large fluxes with uncertain responses to climate. And that is a harder problem to solve because you've got to get a bunch of biological factors, two groups of which are going in opposite directions potentially, and they're both really large and they're both really uncertain. So that's the starting point. But then there's also this other huge caveat, which is that Earth system models are missing a bunch of things that will impact the durability of carbon on land. So we're missing things like plant mortality. We're missing a lot about fires. They have some representation of fires, but a lot about fires. We're missing aspects of nutrient limitation. We could go on and on with this list. And there's observations to support that a lot of these things could be important for land carbon sink. And they're poorly represented. So I would start with this idea that Earth system models and the way that they project land carbon sinks is optimistic. And lots of folks working in the biology space think they're way too optimistic. But that's a starting point we should have here. Okay, so let's come back to our experiments here. We have temperature going up and carbon dioxide going up during this period of time when we're emitting carbon into the atmosphere. So temperature is going up, CO2 is going up. To a certain extent, both of those should increase photosynthesis, although we know temperature also increases respiration. The emergent result from these Earth system models is that the land carbon sink goes up. It goes up over time, some spread. We're going to kind of ignore the red one. Sorry, I didn't remove it from all the plots, but it's got some weird things, and something's not right. But there's some spread in what the Earth system models here are doing. They have different amounts of temperature, different amounts of CO2. The temperature definitely does not necessarily relate to what's going on with carbon. I have tried to relate that directly. Okay, so land carbon is going up during the emissions phase. But let's dig in a little bit more than that. So now just taking one of the models to start with, the green one here, we can see that if we split the land carbon, which is this top line, into its different components, we have the vegetation in this hashed area, we have the soil in the solid area, and the blank part, if there is any, is litter, like soil litter, leaf litter sitting on the ground. Some of the models don't have that. And so we can see that actually it's taking up carbon a little bit into soils, but most of it's going into vegetation. And so these models this model is representing that a lot of this carbon uptake on land is in the vegetation pools. I'm going to expand out and show you what that looks like by latitude. So we're going to see a little bit of interesting features. So this is the same thing. We've got the North Pole up here and the equator in the middle. And remember, there's just not that much land in the southern hemisphere. This is in total units of petagrams carbon, so it kind of already accounts for land area. And you can see that there is a gain in vegetation carbon both in mid and high latitudes and in the tropics. But the soils are all in the mid and high latitudes. So all the soil carbon that's gaining is mid and high latitudes here. That pattern is going to be broadly true across the models. I'm going to show you, but it's a lot to look at. So let's make that one smaller. And these are sort of our two features. Tropical carbon gain is in vegetation, and then there's gain in the mid and high latitudes as well. So here they all are. And you can see there's quite a bit of difference across them. This is their carbon sink during this time period. But they sort of, again, let's ignore the red one. They sort of broadly true. They have a bulge of carbon increase in the tropics, and they have a separate increase in mid and high latitudes, and it's largely vegetation. Some of them have a little bit more soil. Again, there's a lot of differences across these models, so we're kind of trying to understand the similarities. Okay, so that was thinking about this time period when emissions are increasing, temperatures are going up, CO2 is going up. Now let's think about this next part of the time period when the CO2 is high, but it's dropping, and the temperature is high and it's flat. So it's hot, but CO2 is going down a little bit. What's going to happen to the land carbon sink during that time period? So this is the global land carbon sink again, and you can see, well, it's kind of flat. Maybe some of them go down a little, maybe some of them go up a little bit. But during this phase of zero emissions, we're seeing the land carbon is also pretty flat, which means that it's not taking a whole lot of that extra carbon out of the atmosphere, but maybe a little bit. Although the global land carbon is kind of flat, those lines are sort of flat, we can see that that's not true for each of the individual pools. So we've expanded this graph out now. Again, vegetation's in this hashed area, and you can see the solid is soils, and they're continuing to grow a little bit, and the vegetation wedge is shrinking because the top line is coming down and the bottom line is going up. So we're losing vegetation from land, but we're still gaining vegetation, we're losing carbon from vegetation on land, but the soil pools are still growing a little bit. So that's interesting because these will have different implications for how long the carbon's going to stay there, et cetera. Okay, so this is that same profile we saw before, and this is now looking at the change during this phase here of zero emissions. And we're finding that we lost carbon in the tropics, but we gained soil carbon in mid and high latitudes. So again, we're sort of increasing the complexity levels. And this is also broadly true across models. So we're going to lose tropical carbon, and we're going to gain some carbon in mid and high latitudes. A lot of them are losing, not all of them, but many of them are losing tropical carbon and gaining in the mid and high latitudes. So broadly, you could think, oh, maybe that makes sense. It's still hot in the tropics. The CO2 is dropping. Maybe it's too hot in the tropics, and maybe it's still able to increase photosynthesis some in the mid and high latitudes. Or maybe the growth in vegetation that happened is kind of being transferred into soil pools. Okay, so the take-home point here is that the Earth system models say that land takes up carbon while CO2 is rising, but the tropical sinks start to become sources under conditions with declining CO2 when it's still hot. And so that tropical carbon seems a little bit vulnerable. Okay, I want to think next about what happens under declining and negative emissions. So far we've just talked about a scenario where emissions go to zero. First, we don't expect in the real world that emissions will drop to zero immediately tomorrow, but maybe we could ramp them down somewhat more gradually. And so this experiment, again, very idealized in the blue, has the same emissions period, and then it declines carbon for 100 years until it goes right through zero at 150 and to negative 10 at year 200. And then it stays at negative 10 for another 100 years. And when you get to this point, the cumulative emissions are zero. And so we can test a couple of different things with this experiment. We can look at what happens when you're declining more gradually than more steeply. We can look at what happens during this negative emissions phase, and then we can also look at what happens at cumulative zero emissions. Do we return back to the state we were at before? I'll just show you some of those things here. Again, our temperature expectation is that it should look like cumulative emissions. So for this blue experiment, it's going to go up and then come back down again. That would be our first expectation, unlike the orange one which stayed flat. So that's also interesting. We'll get different combinations of temperature and CO2. So what happens in this experiment? Well, when we have these negative or declining in the negative emissions, we do see that temperature increases, right? The first 100 years are the same, but then after 100 years, we see that temperatures keep going up for a while as emissions are dropping, and then they're going to reach some peak and decline as emissions become negative and start drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. I guess let's just say, what's a negative emission? We have not said. We just literally make negative emissions in the atmosphere, but you could imagine it being like carbon dioxide removal, things like that. These little dots are showing you what the peak is on this line. So when does it have its highest point? And you can compare that to the time at which it reaches net zero. And so, their temperatures are kind of clustered close-ish to when you get to zero. That's our expectation from the linear relationship of TCRE, that when you get to zero emissions, you should have, temperature should stop rising. If we look at atmospheric CO2, over here, we can see that those ones all peak before you get to zero emissions. And I think that's interesting. We're not going to talk about it a whole lot here, but basically you have land and carbon sinks still acting, and they're not experiencing the CO2 going down yet. They're still going pretty strong, and their rates are kind of strongest right at that point, so they end up drawing the CO2 down faster, and it peaks first. And that seems pretty consistent across all of these models. Okay, so what happens to the land carbon sinks themselves? Here's CO2 repeated down here. So you can see that it's pretty consistent, and it's happening before you get to net zero emissions. And we've got ocean over here on the right and land over here on the left. And the first thing I want to point out is that there's just more uncertainty on land. The time at which it peaks is much more all over the place. In the ocean, it's pretty consistent. The ocean carbon is peaking. It's peaking at a pretty similar time after net zero emissions in the different models. Our land carbon sinks, the time is more variable. And I'd like to understand more about that. I'll show you a little bit about what I'm doing to try to understand that. Okay, so I'm going to repeat this land carbon sink plot. This is the change in land carbon over the course of this experiment. We've made it a little bigger. We've got our different dots. We're going to ignore the red one. You can see that most of them are peaking after net zero, but we've got these two that are coming before. And I want to look a little bit deeper, only slightly deeper, into what's happening with different carbon pools that might be leading to this outcome. So we'll look again at that green model, and we'll see, again, soils in the solid color, vegetation in this hashed color, and litter in the white. And we can see that vegetation is sort of peaking here not too long after zero emissions, but the soils are delayed. They're lagged behind. And that makes sense. You expect that photosynthesis would add carbon to vegetation, the trees would have to die, then they would turn into soils, and so you're sort of passing that carbon through the system, and the soil timescales are longer. So what we see if we look just at those peak days, now if we look at vegetation here, this is that same total land carbon. Now we've got vegetation over here. These points are about 10 to 20 years after net zero. So the vegetation's coming about 10 to 20 years, or sorry, the total carbon's 10 to 20 years. The vegetation is about 5 to 20. If we look at the soil carbon now, you can see that they're all over the place. the soil carbon pools are even more variable than the vegetation carbon pools. And so there's something a lot more different happening in the soils in terms of how quickly carbon's going into the soils and out of the soils. So I'm really interested in what these timescales are that are controlling these responses, not least of which because there's simple climate models rely on knowing something about the carbon timescales, and hopefully we could inform that with these complex Earth system models, which although they miss a lot of processes, are going to be including way more things than when you write down carbon as, 1 to 3 boxes on Earth. So I'm going to show you how we're going to get some of those timescales. We're going to model the sink as an emission times these 2 exponential decays that each have a time scale in them, and there's a sensitivity term, and we're going to fit the time scales and the sensitivity terms in this equation we know the emissions, and we've got the sink. And so this green line is an example of one of the time series of the sink, land sink, and the black line shows you a fit to this. So I'm going to just show you what those timescales are and talk a little bit about what they're doing. So the short timescale, right? We've got 2 timescales. One of them is going to be shorter, one of them is going to be longer. The shorter timescale across the different Earth system models is somewhere less than 5 years. The longer timescale, I've changed the scale on this one. It goes to 200 now. They're more like 10 to 100 years. Or sorry, 10 to 20 years here. So a bigger spread, longer time scale. But those are the global time scales. Let's look by latitude to try to understand what might be going on. If we look just in the tropics, then we find that this short time scale is really, really short. So the vegetation carbon, the carbon is going into land and it's coming right back out again really quickly. So the fluxes are just really a function of the really recent emissions, right? Less than a couple of years. If we look in the mid-latitudes here and the high latitudes here, we can see that we start to see some longer time scales, so going up to 5 to 10 years. And a couple of models have longer time scales in the high latitudes. So that's telling us that there's different behavior of these time scales in different parts of the globe. That makes sense because we expect decomposition rates to be a function of temperature, and we expect how long trees live might be a function of temperature. There's many things we could expect that vary with latitude, some of which are represented in our system models. If we look now at those longer time scales, we see, again, we saw this one already, so it's something like 10 to 20 years, 5 to 20 years time scale. If we look in the tropics, it's pretty short, but it's still not as short as the short time scale, so something more like 10 to 20 years. But if we look at high latitudes, now we're getting time scales that are going out, 100, 200 years for total carbon on land. And even in the mid-latitudes, we're getting timescales that are much longer. And so this is telling us that there's important longer timescale processes happening in some parts of the globe. But the global timescale looks a lot like the tropics. It's not exactly like the tropics, but it looks most like the tropics. A lot of carbon is in the tropics, so that makes sense. But one thing I would like to argue is that we're missing a lot of the high latitude carbon in our system models. And so maybe we're actually missing that we should have more of this longer timescale represented in the global average because we don't have enough carbon represented in the soils, especially at high latitudes. So I'm going to show you another one of these complicated plots with all the models on it, but this is the initial carbon pools in each of the models, and so you can see they have a lot of soil carbon in a lot of models, but here's an observational estimate, and there's when I asked an expert, he said this is an underestimate of the actual amount of carbon that there is in soils, and you can see none of the models, or maybe this one up here, is starting to get close to the amount of carbon that we think there is in high latitude soils. And so if we're missing the carbon there to begin with, then we're getting those timescales wrong. So the carbon timescales, something like 5 years and something like 10 to 20 years emergent from these Earth system models. But if there's not enough high latitude carbon, then these timescales should probably be longer. Okay, one last note that I don't have a whole lot to dig into is that you might have noticed that this total land carbon is negative by the time we get to cumulative zero emissions. There it is right there. And so it turns out that land is becoming a source, and it's mostly in the tropics. And that's interesting. I haven't really had time to think about it very much. Okay. So coming back to this image I had on the title slide, this is looking at all of this data together for one of these simulations. We've got the time here. This is the removal experiment, so we've got our net zero emissions happening at this line right here. So we have an emissions phase, a declining emissions phase, and a negative emissions phase. Now we've added in latitude here, and so when it's getting greener, it's growing in carbon, and when it's getting pink, it's like lost carbon and gone negative relative to how it was at the beginning. And this is vegetation carbon for one of the models. So what we see as a summary is that sinks are increasing with emissions to some point. They're increasing in the tropics and the mid-latitudes. Land carbon is peaking after we get to zero emissions. You can see that peak happening here, and this peak is really dominated in this model by mid and high latitudes. The response time is these timescales of something like 5 years and something like 10 to 20 years. And at the end, the land is becoming a source when we get to cumulative zero. And so my thought on this one is just, it's been hot for a long time, and the CO2 is dropping, and so you end up losing more carbon than you had in the system initially. So my take-home points, just to reiterate what we've talked about so far, land carbon flux is dominated by biology. That makes it complicated and messy. We're doing our sort of best encapsulation of that with Earth system models. They're still missing things, but it's useful to put all of that together and think about, are there simple explanations that come out of this? Does this suggest really nonlinear behavior, really linear behavior, et cetera? Tropical carbon has big gains with emissions, but it also has big losses under zero and negative emissions. So it's more vulnerable in a lot of ways, or more volatile. It has shorter time scales, but it also has the ability to gain and lose carbon. The Earth system model carbon land sink is probably optimistic. It's missing things that make carbon stocks vulnerable. And so maybe we would expect that there would be more losses from land than we see. And these Earth system models don't have enough high latitude carbon, and so the timescales of the carbon response would be longer if they had more soil carbon to begin with. And that's another caveat we need to consider. So I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. That was a great talk. I love that talk. It really demonstrates why climate is so interesting, involving everything: oceans, biosphere, atmosphere. No cryosphere.
There's permafrost.
Oh, there's permafrost. So time for questions maybe from grad students and postdocs and emeritus faculty first.
I don't know if it would be included, I guess it isn't, but I'm curious if you have an idea about the impact of human-caused land surface changes. So if we imagine while this is happening, the Congo and the Amazon are also being deforested, if that would be a comparable effect, or how that might affect the results.
Yeah, great question. So we know that land use changes are big, and so are they as big as this? Are they bigger than this? I'm not going to attempt to go back to the other slides, but we have an estimate of those land use carbon fluxes, both globally but also spatially aggregated or spatially mapped. And so at this point, I think these losses are significantly bigger. What you have in the complicated scenarios that you would see in a CMIP type RCP run or SSP run has a bunch of land use in it, and one of the things that makes that hard is that they all deal with land use differently, and it's pretty hard to untangle what's being caused by the land use and what's being caused. So I like coming back to these idealized experiments. There are other experiments where they just do land use, and then we can compare sort of the effects of land use. There's a really nice paper that came out about a year ago showing the effects of deforestation on precipitation estimated with one set of experiments and the effect of plant responses to CO2 estimated with another set of experiments, trying to break it down.
So in CMIP 7 there will be more ESM runs, say historical and SSP scenarios. So do you expect a larger spread in the temperatures that we expect because of the interactive carbon cycle?
Yes.
Do you think it's still worth running with interactive carbon?
Yes and yes. So in CMIP 7, the request to different modeling centers has been to run their fully interactive carbon cycle Earth system models as their primary model. That is going to generate more spread because you're adding the carbon cycle, carbon sink uncertainties on top of the physical climate uncertainties. But that is real uncertainty. We've just kind of been ignoring it. So I totally get why the folks who focus on the physical climate system don't want to deal with it because it's extra and messy, but it's real. So I do think I think that's going to be a communication challenge, and it's going to be a challenge to analyze, but I think we need to confront it. I think one of the reasons we haven't made as much headway is because there haven't been as many people working on this problem. And if we confront everyone with this problem, hopefully more people can be enlisted to help make progress on understanding it.
You've shown us the vast range of responses that you get for these experiments and for the HAD-CM3 model experiments also. And one thing that I wondered about is, are all of those models, do they do an equally credible job for if you ask them to run for pre-industrial conditions or over the historical time period? And if they don't, then what implications does that have for interpreting these results?
Yeah, great question, right? So do we feel like these models match the observations of various factors well enough to be considered here? One challenge being we lack data to constrain a lot of aspects of the carbon cycle. So I did pull this one data set. I was really proud of myself. I made this plot yesterday of this observational estimate of soil carbon. But even that is like maybe not the best estimate of soil carbon.
I could imagine them going completely nuts also, and just one reservoir disappearing completely or something like that.
Yeah, so I think with CMIP7, we'll have the historical runs run with these fully interactive carbon cycles that will allow us to do better evaluation in the historical period. And previously, the runs that were done with these fully interactive Earth system models were often just idealized. And so I don't know that we often had the historical period runs to compare with. One test is atmospheric CO2. So we know that really, really well, and they have to get reasonable-ish atmospheric CO2 or they would just be bonkers. But the question is like, well, how much of it's in the ocean and how much of it's on land? Maybe we think we know that from measuring atmospheric oxygen, but there's a lot of lack of constraints. And I would say the simple models are even worse. They do wildly different things with where they put the carbon in terms of land and ocean. And I think there could be really big implications with that. So I think there's a lot of work to do. But again, I hope by making it front and center, a lot more people are going to have to confront that aspect of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so did any of the sources of carbon from the soil include methane?
Oh, they do not include methane in these simulations. Is it important? Well, I mean, it's certainly important in some aspects. Probably, it'd be interesting to quantify. I mean, very few of the models do a full methane cycle at this point. I think just one or two, right? And these models aren't being run with fully interactive chemistry. So they're testing CO2, but since CO2 is inert, they don't have to do the rest of the chemistry to do that. I'm trying to think, I mean, I guess it's usually teragrams of methane and petagrams of carbon. And so from a carbon budget perspective, it's probably not super important. But it certainly feels like it's very important for radiative forcing and all kinds of other downstream effects of the chemistry that could impact plants.
Yeah, you mentioned oxygen, and I was going to ask, have you thought about this in the context of the global oxygen cycle, which on geological timescales requires that all land photosynthesis is required? And Ralph Keeling measured that oxygen is slowly declining.
Yeah.
So that could mean due to less photosynthesis, or it could be due to more carbon burial in soils, leaving the oxygen behind. We try to reconcile these model results. The oxygen data only goes up to the present, I guess.
Yeah, you mean like the atmospheric oxygen measurements, like against CO2? Yeah. So one of the ways we figure out how much carbon has gone, that we've put into the atmosphere has gone into land and ocean is to compare the change in atmospheric oxygen concentration with the change in atmospheric CO2 concentration. And we know, if we know how much fossil fuel flux there's been, we know the approximate ratio between carbon and oxygen. And for photosynthesis on land, we know the ratio between photosynthesis, oxygen and carbon in photosynthesis, and we can make some assumptions about the ocean not exchanging much oxygen. We can solve for the relative amounts of carbon going into land and ocean. There was just a paper like 2 weeks ago suggesting an alternative hypothesis that doesn't match what, that you can reconcile with that framing, but basically saying that the land sink has been much weaker than we've been estimating, and that because there's errors in the fossil fuel fluxes and some difference in the ocean flux within other errors of the estimate of the ocean flux. So it's the weak land sink hypothesis. So I think even that, sort of best top-down observation that about half of the sink is land and half of the sink is ocean is even up for question at this point. And this just makes it really hard to have observations to be able to say, are we doing the carbon cycling right? But we certainly need to try to do that as much as we can during the historical period.
Yeah, we should wrap up. So thank you to the Atmospheric and Climate Science Department for letting us host this colloquium today, and also to those of you who are in this department for making the trek over here. I really appreciate that. And thank you.